It's Monday, the 6th of January. The holidays are over and it's time to get back to work. My name's Juan Brown. You're watching the Blanco Lirio channel, and it's time to jump into the Atlas Air Giant Air 3591 aircraft accident with the NTSB Interim report that's been on my desk since 19 November. That accident occurred back in 23 February of last year. Let's get to work. It's been hard for me to get my head wrapped around this accident, as the Boeing 757-767 aircraft is the transportation aircraft that I have the most experience in flying for a major airline here in the United States. And when I first heard about this accident, I couldn't understand how a crew could take what appears to be a perfectly good airplane and have it stuffed into Trinity Bay within a matter of 30 seconds from 6,000 feet. This immediately brought to mind the Egypt Air accident back in 1999. That accident was a suicide. This is something you cannot do as a good NTSB investigator. You have to approach the investigation with an open mind. You cannot clutter your investigation with any bias towards any previous accidents that you may think are similar to the accident that you are investigating at that time. But because I had that preconceived bias in my mind, when the first reports of how this accident occurred started coming to light, I found them very hard to believe. But now, after going through thousands of pages of NTSB data, I now have a very clear understanding of how this accident has happened, and it appears to me to be one of the grossest cases of pilot error in transport category aircraft that I have ever seen in my 40 years of flying. It was not until I was able to read the pilot transcript that was made available in this NTSB interim report. By the way, this is just the interim report. The final report from the NTSB will still take at least 6 to 8 months, maybe even 12 months to get finalized. But not until I read this CVR, or the cockpit voice recorder data, was I convinced that this was in fact pilot error. This was in fact not an intentional act. These pilots were completely caught by surprise and completely misinterpreted what was going on. And the most shocking thing in this report to me was the fact that the autopilot remained on during the entire sequence. Once again, nobody bothered to click off the autopilot, click off the auto throttle, and fly the airplane. So where do we start with this? Well, let's just start with the facts as we know them, and then we're going to have to get into the issue of how did this pilot slip through the cracks, through the training cracks, and end up in this position to cause this accident. The thousands of pages of data from the NTSB in this interim report narrows it down to the pilots and their actions. In other words, everything else has been ruled out at this time. They've been able to piece together tens of thousands of pieces of this aircraft puzzle back together on a hangar floor and go through all the major systems and found that all the major systems were working properly. They also found that the loading of the aircraft was correct and that the load did not shift. There was no failure of the load before this accident. They also found that though the weather may have played a small factor in this accident in setting up the sequence of events, it was not bad enough weather to preclude flying or to cause this accident on its own. In other words, there was no major microburst or some kind of weather phenomenon that brought this aircraft down. However, it did present a small precursor to the accident, which we'll explain in a minute. So let's start with the report that's known as the Operational Factors / Human Performance Factual Report. Jump on over to page 10. The accident occurred about 1839 Z or 1239 Central Standard Time. Let's pick it up a few minutes before the accident. It's been a normal flight from Miami to Houston. The aircraft is setting up for the RNAV arrival, VNAV descent into Houston. There's a lot of chatter in the transcript about that.
Here's the published Link 1 RNAV arrival into Houston with the runway 26 left transition. These arrivals provide vertical navigation and lateral navigation with speed restrictions to get the aircraft lined up and spaced out for the approach and landing. These are normally flown with the autopilot on and very closely monitored by the crew to ensure that all the restrictions are met. Here's the precision ILS instrument approach the crew was expecting to fly to 26 left via the GAR transition to land here on runway 26 left at Houston. But like many days in flying, there was a weather front passing through the area at the time, which produced some convective activity that the crew and the air traffic controllers needed to work around, fly around. This put the crew in IMC conditions in the clouds. In other words, they couldn't see the ground for this portion of the flight, and there's some turbulence associated with this weather front. This picture was taken 5 minutes after the accident, looking over Trinity Bay.
So let's pick it up about 1834 Z on the factual report from the Human Factors report here. 1834-08, the controller advised Giant 3591 that there was light to heavy precipitation west of the Van intersection, which was about 35 miles ahead, moving eastbound. The controller informed the crew that when they got in closer, they would expect vectors around the weather. 1835, Giant 3591 checked in with the final controller as the airplane was at 11,400 feet and descending via the Link arrival, and advised ATC that they had ATIS information Tango. They had the landing information for the airport. The controller then told the crew to expect vectors to runway 26 left at Houston and asked how Giant 3591, how they wanted to get around the weather. Did they want to fly east and join from the north side, or what do you want to do? According to recorded data about 1836Z, the first officer made a comment in the cockpit related to a possible primary display failure and transferred control of the airplane to the captain. The captain then became the pilot flying. Remember, this is the FO's leg, the first officer's leg. It's he who is flying the aircraft. But now he's handed the controls over to the captain. And the FO became the pilot monitoring, and the captain became the pilot flying. And the FO would do the radio calls. Now, why the FO needed to switch, felt that he needed to switch his flight instruments over is still a bit of a mystery. Apparently, according to his training records, this particular pilot has a tendency to flip switches without a lot of explanation and or knowledge as to why. But at some point along this arrival, he's thinking that for some reason his flight instruments on his side of the aircraft have a problem, and so he wants to hit the EFI, or the electronic flight instrument switch, on his side of the aircraft and bootstrap his flight instruments over to the captain's flight instrument side. Again, there's very little explanation as to why. So he hits the button and the flight instruments are working fine. That means both sets of flight instruments, I believe, are based off of the captain's flight data.
Correction, there are 3 signal generators on the Boeing 7576 series of aircraft, left, center, and right. By selecting the FO's EFI switch to the alternate position, he is selecting the center signal generator, and the captain is still working off of the left signal generator, so the aircraft still has 2 independent sources of flight instrument data.
At 1836, Giant 1391 advised ATC that they'd fly to the west side of the weather, because they're looking at it with their weather radar in the aircraft, and they're supposed to be working this out together as a team as to how they want to approach this weather. And ATC, Air Traffic Control, is giving them the option as to which way they want to attack this weather. ATC can see the weather on their radar as well, but again, it's up to the pilot in command to make the final decision, and the pilot in command is using his own weather radar to help him make this decision. But the decision they make, at 1836, Giant 3591 advised ATC they would fly to the west side of the weather. The controller informed the pilot that the only problem he had was that there was a bunch of departures, so he needed him to descend and maintain 3,000 feet and to expedite his descent. So the decision they made to get around the weather put him in the way of departures, and so in order to deconflict with the departures, ATC is asking Giant to expedite his descent to 3,000 feet. At that point, the aircraft is about 48 miles southeast of Houston at 10,000 feet. Giant 3591 did not initially respond, so the controller repeated the descent clearance and told Giant 3591 to hustle on down to 3,000 feet and informed him that they could expect vectors northbound for a base leg to 26 left at Houston. Giant 3591 again responded to ATC and confirmed the descent down to 3,000 feet. About 10 seconds later, the flight data recorder recorded the speed brake being extended. So at that point, you're getting off of the vertical navigation for the arrival into the airport, and you're reducing the level of automation somewhat by selecting flight level change, setting the altitude window to 3,000 feet, then selecting flight level change, and then extending the speed brakes to start a rather rapid rate of descent down to 3,000 feet. Very standard procedures. According to the recorded data, the first officer then commented in the cockpit that he experienced a potential failure of his attitude director indicator, horizontal situation indicator, the ADI HSI, display information, and then made a comment about using the EFI, the electronic flight information switch. This was followed by the captain commenting on potentially getting the displays back. So again, we don't know what the first officer saw with his instruments, if there was anything at all wrong with them in the first place for him to select the EFI switch.
Again, the EFI switch located right here, which puts the co-pilot's instruments on the center signal generator and includes his artificial horizon and horizontal situation indicator.
At 1837, the controller instructed Giant 3591 to turn to a 270 heading, and the response to ATC was made by the captain, confirming the turn to heading 270 when the airplane was about 40 miles from Houston, descending through 8,500 feet. Shortly afterwards, according to the recorded data, the captain transferred controls back to the first officer. Now the first officer is the pilot flying, and the captain once again became the pilot monitoring and doing the radios. The crew then began setting up the approach into the airplane's flight management computer, the FMC. The crew then began configuring the airplane for the approach and landing and extended the flaps to 1. And this is typical when you're doing that descent in the area. You may very well use a bit of flaps to help you with that descent, and you can lower flaps to 1 with the speed brakes extended, as long as you're within the flap limit speeds, to expedite your descent. Remember, when you extend the flaps to 1, that arms the go-around switches located on the throttles.
Located right here on the 7576 series of aircraft, they're also referred to as toga switches for takeoff/go-around switches.
About 25 seconds later, the airplane's flight data recorder recorded fluctuations in lateral acceleration of the airplane. And about 5 seconds after those fluctuations were recorded on the flight data recorder, the go-around mode was also recorded as being engaged, followed immediately by an increase in the thrust of the engines. At this point, somebody accidentally hit the go-around switches. And this is not uncommon. I've seen this done before. You've got the flaps to 1, the go-around system is now armed, And to understand this, we got to look at the ergonomics of the 767 cockpit. I'll show you here in these pictures. On the side of the two throttles is the auto throttle disconnect button, and underneath the throttles, like this sort of motion, is where the go-around paddles are located. From the FO side, the flap handle is located right here to the right side of the throttles. From the captain's side, in order to reach the flaps, he's got to reach around the throttles to the flap handle. Also on the captain's side, to the left of the throttle quadrant, is the speed brake handle. Back on the FO side, if the FO wants to manipulate the speed brake handle, he's got to reach around the throttles and grab the speed brake handle. When you're on a descent, it's standard practice when you're using the speed brake handle to keep your hand on the speed brake handle. The autopilot's engaged. You should be following through with the flight controls with one hand and then taking the other hand and following through with the speed brake handle, keeping your hand on the speed brake handle to remind you as the pilot flying that the speed brakes are in fact extended, and that which time that you want to level off, you want to retract those speed brakes gently, so smoothly, so you don't get a big bump in the, you can feel that little bump as a passenger in the aircraft once the speed brakes close on a 757-67 aircraft. So that when you level off, the power's not coming up and the boards are hanging out and you're creating a bunch of excess drag. So you got to manage the speed brake handle. But from the FO side, that requires that you reach around the throttle quadrant, potentially bumping the throttle quadrant, especially if you've got a big old watch on and you're in turbulence, and I've seen that happen before. It's not uncommon. Same thing for the pilot reaching around the throttle quadrant to reach for the flaps. It's easy for him to bump the go-around switches while he's reaching for the flaps in turbulence. Let me talk a little bit about that. If you accidentally hit the go-around button, what you're supposed to do, and we see this on the line, it's not too uncommon, you're putting the aircraft in an undesirable state. You don't want to be, it's in go-around when you don't want it to be in go-around. The autopilot's on, so the go-around engages, and it begins a 2,000, in the Boeing 757-67 aircraft, in go-around mode, it will initially begin a 2,000 foot per minute rate of climb, and the power will begin to accelerate towards go-around power setting, and it'll capture an appropriate climb out speed for that go-around. And it's pretty dramatic acceleration and nose lifting moment when you hit the go-around. What you're supposed to do if you want to get out of go-around mode and get back to what you were doing is to fly the airplane. Click off the autopilot and the auto throttles, maintain a pitch and power setting that you want, fly the airplane, take both flight director switches, click them off, count a second or two, put on the two flight director switches one at a time, verify that the mode of the aircraft is in the mode that you want, and then, if you want to, re-engage the autopilot and re-engage the auto throttles. I most recently saw this happen on an approach into London, and it was during a pilot's check ride, so there was extra stress of that going on. I was the third pilot sitting between the two pilots flying, and the check airman was sitting to my right observing the whole ride. We were doing our descent in the Boeing 777 aircraft into London, which is supposed to be a power off noise abatement descent. And somewhere about 2,000 feet or so, by the way, you're supposed to be, in this case, stable, well, in all cases, you're supposed to be stabilized on your approach at 1,000 feet in instrument conditions. We were still 2,000 feet, 2,500 feet high in the turbulence, and the captain inadvertently hit the go-around switch. He didn't know he hit the go-around switch. All of a sudden, the aircraft is initiating a go-around, and both pilots are surprised because they didn't intend to initiate a go-around. Plus the added stress of the check ride going on, I immediately piped up and said, hey, you're in go-around mode, or you're in go-around, you hit the go-around switch. A bit of confusion, and at that point, the check airman piped up and said, hey guys, it's all right, we're above 2,500 feet, you can resume the approach if you want to. In other words, he's telling them, you don't have to go around if you don't want to right now. We're high enough to where we can get reestablished and stabilized on the approach by 1,000 feet and save it. And so they did the correct procedure and turned off the autopilot and auto throttle, turned off the flight directors, got the aircraft reestablished back on glide slope, got the glide slope reestablished, turned on the flight directors and the autopilot and auto throttles, and continued on with the approach. In fact, they might have just continued to hand fly the approach at that point. That's the way it's supposed to go. At 1838-37Z, and while the thrust of the engines was increasing, the controller informed Giant 3591 that they would turn the flight northbound for a base leg in about 18 miles. The flight data recorded the speed brakes retracted to the near zero position. Remember, when you go into go-around mode in the Boeing aircraft, the speed brakes should automatically retract. And you as the pilot need to verify that those speed brakes have retracted if you've been following through on the speed brake control like you're supposed to. The captain then responded to ATC, sounds good, on the radio. ATC then advised Giant 3591 that it was clear on the other side of the weather and they should have no problem getting to the airport. About a second after this ATC transmission, the FO made an expression of surprise in the cockpit, followed by a comment related to airspeed. Now, I don't want to go through the cockpit transcript. You need to read it for yourself there and see what he said about this. It's kind of astonishing. The captain then responded to ATC's previous transmission with OK, which was the last recorded communication between ATC and Giant 3591. And this occurred as the airplane was about 35 miles from Houston, descending through about 6,000 feet. About 3 seconds later, the FO made a comment regarding the airplane stalling, when it was not. At 1839-39, ATC lost radar contact with Giant 3591 about 34 miles from Houston at an altitude of about 5,800 feet. About 16 seconds after the captain told ATC OK, the FDR stopped recording data with the airplane descending at an airspeed of about 433 knots and the autopilot engaged. Now let's look at the airplane performance study, page 2. We'll jump on towards the bottom of the page here. Figure 3 highlights the descent during the last 2 minutes of the flight with selected paraphrased CVR comments overlaid. The descent appears normal until about 12:38:31. Again, they're back at Central Time, 18:38:31 Zulu. And approximately 6,300 foot pressure altitude when the go-around mode was activated using one of the go-around buttons on the throttle quadrant. There was no mention of initiating a go-around by the flight crew on the CVR, cockpit voice recorder, and Flight 3591 had been cleared to descend down to 3,000 feet. The normal load factor shows that the airplane encountered turbulence at about 1838 Z, 6 seconds before the recorded flight mode transition to go-around. The turbulence was likely associated with the cold front mentioned earlier and included in the IMC. So they're in the clouds, cutting through that cold front that was there at the time that's producing this turbulence that causes the accidental actuation of the go-around buttons.
So NTSB investigators jumped in the simulator and recreated this crash sequence and tried all the different ways that you could possibly bump the go-around switches from different positions and different techniques. They also carefully examined the wiring of the go-around switches using CT scans and X-rays from the actual throttle quadrant recovered in the wreckage. They found the wiring to be sound.
The airplane pitch increased from about -1 degree airplane nose down before go-around was enunciated to approximately 4 degrees airplane nose up 6 seconds later at 1838:37. The airplane then pitched airplane nose down to about minus 49 degrees over the next 18 seconds in response to an airplane nose down elevator input. The autopilot is on, but the co-pilot is overriding the autopilot and forcing the nose all the way down to 49 degrees nose low. At about 1838 and 48 and 1838-51, the pilot flying, which was the first officer in the right seat, made comments about the airplane stalling that were recorded on the cockpit voice recorder. However, figure 6 shows that the recorded airplane wing angle of attack and airspeed were below minus 15 degrees and above 250 knots respectively. This is well below the airplane's wing stall angle of attack. The FO is screaming about the aircraft stalling when it is in fact not stalling. Why is he confused about this? We'll get into that in a minute. It has to do with spatial disorientation and specifically the somatographic illusion. Figure 7 shows an elevator split between the left and right sides of the airplane. The left elevator is associated with the captain in the left seat, and the right elevator is associated with the first officer in the right seat. The elevator deflections are similar until about 1838-46. At that time, the first officer is heard asking a question about airspeed on the cockpit voice recorder, and the elevators begin to split. The captain begins to pull from 2 degrees to 8 degrees more aircraft nose up elevator than the first officer. The split continues until about 1838-56, about 1 second after the airplane would have broken out of the reported 3,500-foot cloud layer. Both the captain and the first officer subsequently commanded aircraft nose up elevator until impact. That's where you see the rate of descent decrease slightly in the security footage video. The normal load factor recorded by the flight data recorder in figure 6 is greater than 4 Gs right before impact. That's substantial pull-up forces. So let's talk a bit about this elevator split. When I was getting checked out in the 767 about the year 2000, we were studying extensively, well, I was on the side, the Egypt Air accident, and that's where we first learned, or I first learned, that the 767, you can split the elevators. You can split that is an intentional part of the design to enable you to regain control of the aircraft in the event that a portion of your elevator control should get jammed. If you had a jammed elevator with about 70 pounds of force differential between the two yokes, you can cam out or unjam an otherwise locked control, because remember, in a Boeing aircraft, the yokes work together, but with 70 pounds of force, you can separate those yokes and you can then operate the operational elevator on your side of the aircraft.
The control column override is located right here, and to clarify, once the control columns are split, the operational control column gives full travel to the associated elevator and almost full travel to the opposite elevator. The control column override mechanism is a cam out breakout mechanism similar to what's found on a 737, like in this diagram found in the 737 manual.
So in this case, if you have an FO pushing the nose over, even though the autopilot's still engaged, he's overriding the autopilot servos, he's pushing the nose down with considerable force. The captain in the left seat never says, my aircraft, or I've got the aircraft, or nobody bothers to turn off the autopilot or auto throttles. The captain instead just simply starts pulling while the FO is pushing. They exceed the 70 pounds of force, they get a split elevator. Now that's not enough to cause the airplane to really twist in. It just, they've got the nose down so low at 49 degrees, and at that altitude, less than 6,000 feet, there is virtually no hope for recovery. So why did the first officer think the aircraft was stalling when it in fact was not? This has to do with spatial disorientation. We've talked about this before in the recent Piper Cheyenne crash. When you are operating in instrument conditions, you are relying on your flight instruments. You have to believe and trust in your flight instruments at all times, because the human ear simply is not developed to handle reference when there is no reference to the ground. When there is no visual reference to the ground, you cannot tell which way is up without reliance on flight instruments. To add to that, if you add an acceleration force in the forward direction, your inner ear will interpret that as a pitching up, a severe pitching up moment, and that's what's known as the somatogravic illusion, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. If you ever watch F-18 or Navy pilots blasting off of a catapult, I'll put a link down below. This was a big problem for naval aviators for years, especially when blasting off of a catapult launch at night. They were finding that so many naval aviators were taking a perfectly good airplane after a catapult launch and pitching them down into the drink. And this was because of the somatogravic illusion, especially at night with the limited horizon or no horizon visual cues to help you see which way is up. And with that sudden acceleration from 0 to 180 knots in 3 seconds, the illusion is very powerful that you're pitching up way beyond an angle that you should be. In fact, you may very well be stalling the aircraft, so the natural pilot instinct is to push the nose down. So what the Navy did to cure that problem in catapult launches, if you look on those videos, is they remove their hands completely from the controls of the aircraft. They get the thing set up in full afterburner with the nose trimmed up, boom, launch that jet off the aircraft carrier, and until it's safely clear off the edge of the deck, does the pilot resume control of the aircraft to avoid this effect.
Here's a still of a catapult launch. The left hand is on the throttle, the right hand is off the controls and firmly gripping the "oh-no" bar. Once airborne and no longer under the extreme acceleration of the catapult, the pilot quickly grabs control of the airplane and resumes flying.
So instead of reacting to the reaction of your inner ear, the pilots should have looked at the FMA, the Flight Management Annunciator panel, verified that the aircraft, what mode the aircraft automation was in. They would have seen go around, go around, go around on the flight FMA panel, indicating that the aircraft was in fact in the go around mode, and should have done the proper response of clicking off the autopilot and the auto throttles, obtaining a normal attitude of the aircraft and pitch and power setting, turning off the flight director switches and resetting them. Instead, they just reacted and shoved the nose of the plane over.
Here's what the FMA would have looked like. Go around for the auto throttle mode, go around for the pitch mode, go around for the roll mode, and command indicating the autopilot was still on. Go around is also enunciated above the engine gauges, above the engine pressure ratio indicators. Here's what each column of the flight mode enunciator indicates. To understand the somatogravic illusion, we got to first look at the vestibular system of the inner ear. The inner ear has 3 semicircular canals, which gives us balance and spatial orientation. These 3 canals are approximately 90 degrees apart from each other and gives us longitudinal, vertical, and lateral balance. The tiny hairs in the inner ear also detect acceleration. And when you no longer have visual reference to the horizon, your brain has a hard time detecting the difference between acceleration versus pitching moments up and down. Thus, the somatogravic illusion during rapid acceleration that feels like you're pitching nose high, and the natural pilot reaction is to lower the nose.
As I mentioned before, this particular FO had a very spotty training record, and the question is, how did he slip through the cracks? Back in 1987-94 timeframe, there were a series of fatal accidents, 7 of them, that resulted in the Pilot Records Improvement Act of 1996. And this required that all air transport operators were required to review the pilot's records, training records, and records of employment for the previous 5 years. Then after the Colgan Air disaster in, 1999, one of the many fallouts of that accident was, in addition to this, the Pilot Records Database was created, the PRD. This was supposed to be a one-stop shopping place where all the pilots' records for the last 5 years could be found by employers so they could review them before they hired somebody for employment as an airline pilot. The PRD ruling was made in 2010. This rule is still not yet in place by the FAA some 9 years later. They're still going through stage 3 of this with a notice of proposed rulemaking to put on the final touches of how they're going to implement the Pilot Records Database regulation. So because of these loopholes, not all of the information of the first officer's flying records, employment history was made available to Atlas Air before they hired him. Usually these tasks of researching employment records and histories and databases are usually farmed out to other contractors, as is the case here at Atlas Air. Now let's talk a little bit about the pilot hiring process. This is good information for those of you that are aspiring for a career in aviation. When you go to apply for a major airline, you've got to show your complete employment history. You've got to get that down to a 1 or 2 page resume showing no gaps in employment history. You have to show all the gaps in your employment history. This particular FO had 2 major gaps in his employment history that he did not pass on to Atlas Air, and in those 2 gaps of employment history was some more of his checkered training record. The problems in the training of those 2 omissions were never known to Atlas Air. Had Atlas Air known about these omissions and additional training problems, they probably would have never hired him in the first place. So not only does your resume have to be complete and thorough, you simply cannot lie on your resume when applying to an airline. And omitting something is the equivalent of lying, and they're going to find out one way or another, either through these regulations, through the FAA, or through word of mouth. The aviation industry is a very small industry. Somebody's going to know you from somewhere before, and they're going to talk about your prior history. But in this case, this particular FO got away with it, and he slipped through the cracks despite his checkered training past. I'll leave a link. That's a whole nother report in this NTSB report of all the different failures he's had along his career. Let me talk a little bit about busting check rides and what that amounts to. If you're a military pilot, you get 3 chances. 3 strikes, you're out. There is nothing more motivating than being in pilot training and watching half of your class wash out during the year of pilot training, and some of those guys are washing out with just 3 bad rides in a row, and they are back home selling vacuum cleaners within a week. In the civilian world, you're given a little more leeway, but by the time you get to the ATP air transport pilot rating world, you have got to perform. You have got to be trainable. The airlines have a limited amount of resources to get you trained up. You need to get through that program and get through it hopefully on time. If you do not get through your training program on time, every little delay will be recorded. If in the event that you bust a check ride, each time you have a problem like busting a check ride, your issue gets elevated to a higher level of management. And by the time the 3rd bust comes around, the FAA is directly involved, and they are in the simulator with you, making sure that you can pass the check ride or not. Some cases, instructors will not send you to a check ride, but recommend you for additional training before your check ride and save you the wrath of the FAA, so to speak, and get you that additional training, but that will also be recorded in your training record, and that's okay. You are allotted extra training as required, but it is recorded in your training file. Now, once you have some kind of a problem in your training record, there's usually, like they say in Animal House, double secret probation. There's usually a monitoring status that is assigned to you, and this was in the military, done in the military as well. If you're having problems in your training or have busted a ride, you are usually given a special monitoring status that alerts folks that you've had problems in training and you need to be watched closely, and hopefully you can get this cleared up within about a year or so. And that was the case for this captain of Giant Air 3591. He did have one hiccup in his training record, and he was placed on monitoring status for a little over a year, got that cleared up and proceeded on. In the case of the FO, Atlas never put the FO on any sort of special monitoring status, claiming that, or because of gaps in his training or other personal issues, somehow they never put him on any kind of monitoring status. By the way, the captain was about 60 years old with 11,000 hours of flying time, and the FO was 44 years old with about 5,000 hours of flying time. Usually when you get to 60 years old, you're getting close to retirement age. The classic career progression for most airline pilots is to start out at a very young age, like I did, 14, 15, 16 years old, solo license, and then work on getting your ratings. In my case, go join the military, and then get your ATP rating, and then work towards getting your airline job. Which means by the time you get close to retirement, by 65, you're probably in the 20,000 plus hour category. Now, as we've got the pilot shortage going on, and there's a more commonly, the whole idea why you want to do that, why you want your career to proceed like that, is because of the money. You're forced to retire as an airline pilot at age 65. You need to get on early to earn the most money and get the most seniority that you can, to get the best schedules and earn the most money towards your retirement. But with the pilot shortage, today we're seeing a lot more career changes in midlife. We're seeing folks that are in the 30, 40 year range, civilian guys deciding, I want to go learn how to fly and become an airline pilot. And that was the case with the captain here at Atlas. He got his pilot's license, I believe he began flying around 1999. So a lot to look at and to think about in this report here. Is this a trend? Are we seeing more training issues as we work our way through the looming pilot shortage? The NTSB will have the final report on this. It won't be out until at least 6 months, 8 months, possibly a whole nother year, where they're going to put all these pieces together and lay out exactly what happened in this tragic accident. So we get more information, we'll see you here. Thanks for your support. Thanks for watching. See you here.